and you're like, wow, last night and then tonight, this is just too much information. It does get more, I guess it gets lighter, I should say, and more, what about dinosaurs is a lot more fun than did Darwin murder God? So don't be overwhelmed. It's not always going to be like this, but I do feel like I have to cover some of this stuff before I get into the fun and more enjoyable, less brainy stuff. So just bear with me. I will try to break it down. But the basic thing I want you to get from the earlier presentation is that it just seems that the earth is in a special place for creation, for life to exist, and that it seems to point to a creator. It doesn't prove it. It doesn't disprove evolution. But it is a logical look at the facts where you can intelligently say, this is a problem I have with evolution. And if you are evolutionists, it's just something that you need to study out and deal with and understand that we are just trying to present stuff that's normally not talked about in the science classes. And so speaking about that, we are going into Did Darwin Murder God? And this title, it's kind of a shocking title, comes from this quote.
Talk for a second. I have to unplug you.
Okay, in Time magazine. Okay, so this is the quote from Time magazine. Charles Darwin didn't want to murder God, as he once put it, but he did. That was the December 31st issue, 1999, the iconoclast of the century, Charles Darwin, in Time magazine. And so that's where the title comes from, this idea that Charles Darwin didn't want to murder God, but Time is saying that's what he did. And last night we talked about how there was 3 phases that brought us to modernism, and we talked about the first phase at 5 with the shift in astronomy. Phase 2 was the mechanical idea of the universe, and then phase 3 was Charles Darwin, and that left the default mode in modernism is kind of atheism or practical atheism. What I mean by that is the default mode, a way we live our life as if God doesn't exist. The theist actually has to try, where before life was a theistic life. Ancient world, there was God or gods and fairies and elves and all these kinds of, the supernatural was all over. Now the supernatural, you actually have to put forth effort. So someone who is really a theist really is a theist because they're putting forth effort. And so the default mode is more of a atheist or practical atheist, meaning you kind of live your life as if God isn't there. That's kind of the default mode. And so, did he murder God? So we are going to do some dictionary definitions so that we understand what we're talking about. Natural selection is kind of the famous thing that Darwin was proposing, and it is the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. The theory of its action was first fully expounded by Charles Darwin and is now believed to be the main process that brings about evolution. And you can compare it with survival of the fittest. So when I was researching, compare survival of the fittest, well, I better look that up. Survival of the fittest. In biology, the continued existence of organisms that are best adapted to their environment with the extinction of others as a concept in the Darwinian theory of evolution compare with natural selection. So they kind of go hand in hand. Natural selection and survival of the fittest are kind of the main point that Darwin was trying to make. So for them, the Darwinists, natural selection is a tautology which states a heretofore unrecognized relation. The fittest, defined as those who leave the most offspring, will leave the most offspring. So the problem with this, just like the principle we studied earlier, the idea that life exists because it was, the perfect conditions are there, and that's why life can exist, because the conditions are perfect as a tautology, and so the creationists get labeled as, hey, that's wrong because it's a tautology. We can point right back and say, well, so is survival of the fittest. So Touche. Of one thing, however, I am certain, and that is that natural selection affords no explanation of mimicry or of any other form of evolution. It means nothing more than the survivors survive. Why do certain individuals survive? Because they're the fittest, because they survive. So when you ask, why did certain species survive? They were the fittest. Why were they the fittest? Because they survived. That's what I mean by tautology. It's circular. And it's circular reasoning. It doesn't necessarily disprove it, but like it is an issue. And so what's a tautology? Tautology is saying the same thing twice in different words, generally considered a fault of style. If you're really trying to explain something, you need to explain it, not just repeat it. So the question is, why did it survive? And the answer by Darwinian evolutionists, because it's the fittest. Then, or you could ask the question, how do you know it's the fittest? The answer would be because it survived. That's what I mean by tautology. You're just saying the same thing. And so that's a problem. So Darwin's finches are kind of like the famous example. This is a picture from a textbook where they'll show this is evolution. We have proof right here that it exists. And that's kind of something that they put out there. And these finches are the, picture, the example that evolution occurs. So many biology textbooks give Darwin undeserved credit for the use of the finches as an example of natural selection in the theory of evolution. Here's the facts. The finches are discussed in Darwin's diary except for one passing reference. So his diaries, when he was doing this, he hardly mentioned the finches. The finches are never mentioned in Darwin's book, Origin of the Species. The natural selection observed in the 1970s actually reversed direction soon after, resulting in no net evolutionary change. Several finch species appear to be merging. So they diversified, and now they're coming back together. So it's not like getting farther and farther apart. There's almost like a rubber band effect. They diversifying, stretched out, and then when conditions change, they start mating with each other and coming back together into one species. So it's kind of like this kind of flow. So Darwin attributed the difference in bill size and feeding habits among these finches to evolution that occurred after their ancestors migrated to the Galapagos. And so this is what the biology textbook says, which is funny because what do they say? Darwin attributed the difference in bill size when most of Darwin hardly talks about finches. So here's a textbook saying Darwin did this when it didn't really happen, and then he talks about the bill size and feeding habits caused this evolution. So the experiments that we're talking about the finches in the 70s, Grant's experiments, noticed that when there was a drought, it would make the seeds less available. This would make a 15% reduction on one island's medium ground finch population. The survivors who would make it through the drought they were larger in size in both body and beak. Natural selection favored the birds because they were able to reach the larger, tougher seeds, and the average beak depth started increasing by 5%. So the conclusion is natural selection can produce change in beaks. This could also explain the origin of a species among these different finches. It would require 20 such selection events to transform one species into another. With one drought each 10 years, it would only take 200 years before you would have a different species. However, there's a problem. When they started studying the chromosomes of these different finches, there was no difference. No natural selection in the wild has been observed with the finches, and the finches are still what? I'll get to this later, but I think there's more diversity in the human race than there are in the finches. And so next weekend we'll get into some of that, but that's next weekend. So later experiments show that the finch population and average beak size returned back to its normal size when the drought ended. So yes, the drought was causing some difference in sizes, but as soon as the drought ended, it went back to normal. Oscillating selection cannot produce any net change. It's like the rubber band. Several species of finches appear to be merging actually into one, like I said before, and they end up not being different species after all. They're still just finches. And this is what I was talking about. There's no problem with quote-unquote microevolution, variation. And even if it produced two different kinds of finch species and they completely become different species, I don't have a problem with that because I don't think the Bible says that God created a set species. I think he created kinds and they produced variations. For example, scientists acknowledge that all dogs descend from a common ancestor and all are dogs. Yet there are far greater differences among dogs than there are among Darwin's finches or than most other subspecies in the world, and all biologists classify dogs as being the same species. What's interesting is a lot of dog breeds have been selected and made within human history. And they're very, very diverse. You go from St. Bernard, bull mastiff, and mastiffs and bulldogs to chihuahuas and pugs. Very, very, very different. And it's because we're able to select and breed, and so we make microevolution happen really fast, but we're manipulating it as an intelligent being. And the same thing with cats. So my dad has this cat breed book, and I'm reading through it, and they're like, oh, this cat breed came about like 100 years ago. It looked completely far out and weird compared to the other cats. It's because humans are able to manipulate and do things. We do it with agriculture, both plants and animals. We were just at the Berrien Youth Fair, and they had all these different species of bunnies, and they get rewards for which ones are raised the best. And how those different breeds happen is because people want a certain trait, and they just keep them together. And so these things happen. So microevolution is what is presented as facts for evolution, and people just swallow the whole theory based on microevolution. I'm not saying that microevolution doesn't exist. I think it exists. I think it fits perfectly with the Bible. That's not the issue. So Darwin's finches don't prove evolution on a macro level, and in fact, it's not even really proving at a micro level because they're not even creating new species. So Charles Darwin gave many examples of variation within species and tried to use them to prove evolution outside of the true species. I started reading through his book, and I noticed a lot of stuff he was saying was microevolution, and he would say, see, here's this change, therefore we can see where all the species came from. So he would jump from microevolution to macroevolution with no proof in between. So the question is new species. So here is Charles Darwin himself. When we descend to the details, we can prove that no species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory. So he's saying, listen, it's a theory. He sees microevolution, he sees changing happen, but he says we don't have proof of new species coming out. Well, we now have proof of new species coming and arriving, like my botanist friend, but even then doesn't bother me because the Bible doesn't use the word species, it uses the word kind. What level on the tree, we have species and genus and, phylum, kingdom, order, and all that stuff. What level is kind? I don't know. But to me, the wolf, the dog, the fox, all those canines might possibly come from two canines off the boat of Noah's Ark, and it gave us all that variety. Because the variety within the dogs themselves is just as diverse as the fox, and all of that. And maybe the fox is separate, but you get what I'm saying? It's kind, not species. We don't have to get caught up in the idea. But even Darwin said at the time, I just don't see new species coming out. Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionist, said, most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record looking much the same as when they disappeared. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. That's why he threw out Darwinian evolution. Stephen Jay Gould went to a different model, which I'll explain sooner. And that's why he's saying this. He's like, listen, gradual change over time is not in the fossil record, and we haven't seen it. There's no facts. We have to come up with a different model. And he did, because he couldn't see it. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology, which is the study of fossils, does not provide them. There's no evidence of it. Evolution, at least in the sense that Darwin speaks of it, cannot be detected within the lifetime of a single observer. So remember the definition of science, it needs to be observable and testable. These guys are coming out and saying, and listen, we haven't seen it. It takes too long, and it's not in the fossil record. So it's not provable. It's not falsifiable. There's a problem with the theory then. The geological record is extremely imperfect, and this fact will, to a large extent, explain why we do not find intermediate varieties, connecting together all the extinct and existing forms of life by the finest graduated steps. He who rejects these views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. Charles Darwin, Origin of Species, page 341 to 342. See, good science, when they come up with a theory, one of the ideas is it's supposed to be falsifiable. So early science, you would come up with a theory, and if you're a good scientist, you'd say, if my theory is wrong, this would prove it wrong. So Darwin, admitting this, is just doing good science. He says, listen, I have this theory, I see what we would call microevolution. Maybe this is how species came about, and he's trying to do it from an atheistic framework. Even though originally he was a believer, he's, struggling with stuff. And he says, if there's no God, this is possibly how it could happen. Then he later goes in and shows, however, if you look at the fossil record and you can't find this, then my theory is proven wrong. And at the time when Darwin said this, the fossil record, paleontology, barely existed. So he could say this and be like, I don't know, we just have to dig more, find more fossils, and see if we can prove my theory right. So that's 1901, 1981. There are 100 million fossils, all cataloged and identified in the museums around the world. Very different. So in 80 years, we have 100 million fossils. Very different in Darwin's time. Darwin could say this and still believe his theory because we don't have that many fossils. Now we have millions. Intermediate links. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic change, and this is perhaps the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. So we have millions of fossils, and there's no... So Darwin himself said, if you don't find graduated steps in the fossil record, you can reject my theory. We still don't have them, and we have found millions. He said, okay, this most serious objection, if you don't want to believe in Darwinian evolution, you have to have intermediate links. If I can't provide them, and we don't see them yet, yeah, this is a serious objection. And so that brings us to the Cambrian explosion. There is no question that such gaps exist. And the biggest gap a big gap appears at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. Over 500 million years ago, according to the data of testing of time, the word just slipped from me. The dating methods. Over 500 million years ago, when great numbers of new species suddenly appeared in the fossil record. So basically what happened in the Cambrian layer, which is supposed to be 500 million years ago, it's kind of what the video was talking about, all of a sudden there was below it, there's very simple, and all of a sudden, boom, everything appeared. The way Darwin explained things, it would have to be gradual with a bunch of intermediate links. So literally, if you were drawing, you know how they always draw the evolutionary tree as a single trunk that branches? It seems actually like it goes like this. It comes up and then it all literally explodes and branches out. And so instead of a tree, it's actually like a bush, and extinction takes place and we're actually getting narrower. There was more species in the Cambrian period than there is now. And everything's fully there. It just all of a sudden, boom, it all appears. And so there's a huge gap. Darwin said if there's gaps, you have a serious problem. They started studying the fossil record, and the Cambrian explosion shows up, and they're like, boom. There's paleontologists that seriously struggle and are abandoning Darwin evolution because they're like, there's a gap. He said if there's a gap, don't believe my theory. There's the biggest gap that could be with the Cambrian explosion. The fossil record shows that phylum level differences appear at the lowest levels in the Cambrian period, and this has been referred to as this Cambrian explosion. There is no fossil evidence connecting Cambrian animals to organisms preceding them. There is no long history of gradual divergence predicted by Darwin. The Cambrian explosion gives rise to most of the animal phyla alive today, as well as the same phyla that are now extinct. It's all there. It's actually even more than what we have now, and it's all fully there. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument. He's an evolutionist. He believes in it. He's teaching it. Someone asked him, do you have evidence? And he's like, no. So earlier I told you the problem is the probability of life happening on this planet. The probability of Darwin's theory existing as gradual, slow evolution, there is no evidence. There is none. Only microevolution, and that is a leap in logic. It's a faith step. And if someone wants to believe it, it's okay. Just admit that you're taking that step. And if someone doesn't want to follow you in that step, the burden of proof is on you to provide the evidence. So, given the fact of evolution, one would expect the fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to the descendants, but this is not what the paleontologist finds. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every phyletic series. Darwin said the most serious objection is the gap, and we find the gaps. We have enough fossils. The evidence is not there. So even Charles Darwin thought natural selection could not account for peacocks, tails, or similar fantastic structures so prominent in courtship displays. On the contrary, elaborate appendages or tail feathers could easily get in the way when animals had to escape enemies. Still, if elaborate plumage makes the bird more vulnerable to predators, why should evolution favor them? These, peacocks, that's a ridiculous bird if you're doing survival of the fittest. It would not be very fit. Sure, he could attract more mates, but if he gets eaten before he could mate, what good is it? So one of the things, and I don't think it's airtight, disproves evolution. I think what I just presented to you is the biggest thing. You want me to believe evolution, provide the evidence. I do this in seminars all the time. I've had atheists come and I ask them for evidence, and they might come up with like one weird dinosaur bone. And I'm like, listen, the problem is you need all of them. And even those are arguable. Like one dinosaur that has some feathers, I'm like, that even between that dinosaur with feathers, the gap between and after that to birds and reptiles is huge. So the burden of proof is on the evolutionist to provide the evidence, and they haven't, which shows what I presented in night one. If you don't believe God exists and you don't want him to exist, you're presupposed to have that, and therefore you don't want to see that you don't have evidence. And you won't, no matter what I present in the data, will change my mind. Just like if you present to a theist problems, lots of times they won't listen to you either. And so that's the problem. But irreducible complexity, to me, is something else that makes it evolution improbable. I think the lack of fossil record is a much more solid argument, because even Darwin admitted that, but irreducible complexity has been brought up, and it's an important point. And so one of my favorite ones is the giraffe. The giraffe is my mom's favorite animal, and the giraffe averages a height of 18 feet. Its heart can be up to 22 inches long. So you have this giant heart pumping blood. It's this huge pump. And so it has to pump the blood up to the brain, up that long neck, right? The problem happens is when it bends over to get a drink, because what happens when it starts going downhill? That big heart's going to pump, that pressure is going to change from way up there to way down there, and it's going to come in and it's going to give the giraffe an aneurysm. So when it bends down the drink, it's going to fall over and it's going to die, and then the lion's going to have giraffe burgers that, evening for dinner. That's the problem. So without a special design, the giraffe would burst its brain from the blood pressure when it lowered its head. So the answer, what happens is that there's different valves located along the neck that shut off the blood flow when it starts bending down, so the blood pressure stops. But the problem is if it does that, when it picks its head back up, it wouldn't have enough blood and it would pass out. So there's a special sponge at the end of the neck that last bit of blood that's coming in gets absorbed as extra blood, and then when it raises its head back up, it splashes in so it won't faint. So sometimes this happens with taller people. If you're laying on the ground and you're tall and you jump up, you'll get lightheaded. Do that times, you're at the tallest, mostly 7 feet. Do that with an 18-foot person, you're going to be like really wobbly, but they're specially designed to be able to drink. Oh no, I have to get up and move really fast. A lion's coming, get up, the sponge squeezes the blood into the head and it's able to run. So a horse gradually getting its neck stretched out over time would not have the valves, would not have the sponge, would not have all those things working together. But all of that has to be there together, or the giraffe is going to be lion food on the plains of Africa. So another interesting species for dealing with irreducible complexity is the woodpecker. So the woodpecker has to have all these components. It has to have the hard beak, special feet, and special tail feathers. The beak has to be hard enough that it can hammer into the wood. The tail feathers also have to be like a tripod to keep it balanced, and its feet are special because normally a bird has 2 and then 3, but they actually have 4 so they can hang on the side of the wood. So the hard beak, the special feet, and the special tail feathers all have to be there, as well as the barbed tongue, because what good is it to get in there and get an insect if you can't get it out? All of those things need to be in the place. On top of that, in between the beak and the skull is a shock absorber. Because imagine, beating your head over and over again. Professional football players, what's happening to them? CTE. The woodpeckers don't get CTE. It's because they have, they have things that football players don't. A cartilage shock absorber. They have the thickest skull per body weight of any organism. So if the woodpecker also, if it keeps its eyes open, what would happen when it hits? No more woodpecker. It would be blind. But they're able to open and close them rapidly so that they, you ever heard, how fast does woodpecker go? You ever hear one on the side of a house? Yeah. They have special eyelids that they're able to open and close them that fast in between each hit, so they know where they're hitting. So all of these things have to come together. The tongue, like I talked about, they're usually 6 inches long, barbed. They can stab the bug and bring it into its mouth, but it's barbed. What happens when you get a fish hook? You ever get one accidentally stuck in your finger? Is it fun to get out? They're barbed, right? Easy going in, hard going out. Well, the glue on the end of the tongue and the barb is so special that it allows it to dissolve the bug, and so it can swallow it. Because the bug's stuck to the tongue, you swallow the bug on the tongue, you swallow your tongue, you don't do so well. So all of these components all have to be there for the woodpecker to be able to do its thing. So it's not like just a Darwin's finch suddenly gets harder and harder beak, and then it can able to hammer into the wood. It needs the special tongue, the special tail feathers, the special feet, the special eyes, all of that has to be in place, all at once in order for the woodpecker to be able to do its thing. And I don't know how to explain this one. This is actually one because I believe in microevolution, so I don't know how this woodpecker has a tongue that goes, instead of out here, it goes down, around, over, up, down, and around like that. I don't know how slow, gradual process that could evolve. So my solution, there must have been at least 2 woodpeckers pairs on Noah's Ark. Because I believe in microevolution. I think it happens. I don't think every single species that we have was on the boat. But I do think there was more than one woodpecker because I can't explain that. That doesn't make any sense. So another fun one, the chuckwalla, it's this salt machine. So it's in the desert, and it receives its water just from eating food. It doesn't drink. And so this creates too much salt in the blood. And so it's building up all the salt, and it has a desalting system that kicks in, and the lizard will, when it builds up the salt, it sneezes it out. So this whole process is super complicated. All those parts would have to be in there, otherwise it would just get too salty and die. So it's a super complicated thing. There's other cool things about it. When it's being chased, it'll run into a crack, and then it'll puff itself up with air so the predator can't pull it out. And then the lizard is dark in the morning to absorb heat, and then lighter in the day to reflect. So all these things help it to survive, and they're very complicated processes. So even like the chicken egg is actually quite an amazing organism. The egg shell actually is porous, has holes in it, so air can come in. And this is how it works when you're developing the chicken. On exactly the 5th day of development, a blood vessel will hook into the air sac to breathe, and another one will hook into the yolk for food. So it start eating the nutrient-rich, dense yolk to start growing it as fast as possible, as well as an air pocket. If it waits the 6th day, it dies. If it does it too early, it doesn't have enough oxygen. So exactly the 5th day it comes and it does that. Then on the 19th day, exactly on that day, the chick uses its egg tooth, which is this little pointy part on its beak, to break into the air sac with its egg tooth. And then it has 6 hours of air left in that sac to break a hole in the shell so that more air can come in. And then on the 21st day, it can come out. If any one of those days is off and it messes up, the chicken dies. So the egg has this complicated process to make the chicken become a chicken. So this is Darwin, Origin of Species. This is what Darwin said. So he traveled the world and he observed things, and one of the things he observed was a bear, and this is what he said. In North America, the black bear was seen by herons swimming for hours with widely open mouth, thus catching like a whale insects in the water. Even in so extreme a case like this, if the supply of insects were constant, and if better adapted competitors did not already exist in the country, I can see no difficulty in a race of bears being more and more aquatic in their structure and habits, with larger and larger mouths, till a creature was produced as monstrous as a whale. Darwin believed that a bear slowly evolved into the whale. And you think the Bible is full of a bunch of fairy tales. I'm sorry, that was a little bit of a low blow, and I apologize. But do you see what I mean? That's very fanciful. It's just as fanciful as a flood or getting swallowed by a whale and spit out like Jonah. A bear slowly becoming a whale is a huge scientific fantasy. That's science fiction. I'm sorry. So that's what they're... Well, let's talk about the bear. The North American bear hibernates to 5 to 7 months, and having their young and nursing them while in hibernation. So the male bear can sleep, and I understand that, but the mom bear not only hibernates and sleeps that long, she's also nursing, which takes what? Nutrients, right? To produce the milk. And this is happening 5 to 7 months. What happens when you sleep too long and you stop moving? It's called atrophy. Your muscles start shrinking, right? So the mother bear consumes no food or water during hibernation. In fact, what happens is there's this internal complex factory that converts fat into fluid in order to produce the milk for the young to survive. And instead of exerting waste, like it normally does, going to the bathroom, the material is actually, when hibernating, is recycled to keep nourishing the bear and its cubs. During hibernation, the bear only uses 20% of its weight. If a human were to hibernate for that long, it would lose 90%. But what they've studied, they've put cameras in the hibernating cave, and they found that they actually do isometric exercises while they're hibernating and sleeping. Isometric is that, they kind of flex and press, like they're dreaming and they're like flexing and pushing, and so they're actually exercising while they're hibernating and sleeping. And so that's why they're able to stay fit. Yeah, they come out a lot skinnier, and that's why they have to fatten up. That's why they pretty much all they do is look for food for the whole time when they're out, and then they go to sleep. But there's all these facts have to come together in order for it to be able to do what it does. And so Darwin said bears became whales. Well, let's look at whales. One of the whales, the sperm whale, can breathe air 5,000 gallons a minute. It can weigh up to 300,000 pounds. Their tongue alone can weigh as much as an elephant. The flippers are actually filled with these blood vessels that they're kind of like solar panels that they can be used to warm up. And then they use air bubbles to catch and kill their food. And they dive at 500 feet a minute, 550 feet a minute. The sperm whale can shut down all of its systems except for the heart, brain, and tail that conserve energy so it can get down to its food and, without needing to breathe. There's a pressure drop of 1 atmosphere every 12 feet. So a 70-foot-long whale makes the difference between the amounts of pressure, about 3 or 5 different amounts in its entire body, and it has mechanisms that direct the pressure over its different body that compensate for all the ability to do that. They also can communicate over hundreds of miles and they're highly social. In fact, our idea of sonar came from studying whales. And the blowhole also is not connected to its mouth, which is highly important because its ability, to breathe is on top where it would need to be, and its ability to eat is down below exactly where it needs to be, and it doesn't get mixed up. So whales are very different than bears. They're very complicated. Bears are very complicated. So new Darwinists have thrown that theory out. So where did whales come from? Because they believe that whales are not naturally, this is how it's believed. They believe that single-cell organisms produce different things that produce fish. Fish produce amphibians. Amphibians produce reptiles. Reptiles kind of produce mammals and birds. So mammals are not supposed to be in the water. They're supposed to be on the land. So that must mean mammals have returned to the water, according to the theory of evolution. So this is now kind of the common thing. Traditional forms have been scarce, but a few fossils were recently discovered in India of a four-legged mammal whose skull and teeth resemble whales. During the 1980s, serum protein tests were made on whales' blood to compare it with the biochemistry of other living animal groups. The results linked them not to bears or carnivores, but to hoofed animals. Forerunners of the whales were closely related to the ancestors of cattle, deer, and sheep. Such a conclusion fits with the general behavior of great baleen whales who move in pods or herds and strain the sea for plankton. They are like antelopes or cattle or social grazers. Encyclopedia of Evolution. So it's not the bear, it's the cow. It doesn't help me. I'm sorry. I can't imagine a cow jumping into the water and gradually, eventually becoming the whale. It doesn't help. And there's tons of creatures. There's the elephant, the gecko, the dragonfly, penguins. In fact, a lot of the animals I got, there's these videos. They're great for kids. And so if you're older, bear with them. I think they're geared for kids. But they have good science, good facts in them. They're called Amazing Creatures That Defy Evolution. There's 3 volumes of them. You can actually, I think, buy all 3 volumes for pretty cheap. Great resource. He's actually was an evolutionist. And he was in Texas. There's lots of Christians there, and they're constantly bothering him. And he started looking at this idea of irreducible complexity. And for him, the data was enough to say, hey, I can't buy this anymore. I don't think it's the best argument, but I do think it's up there. I think the lack of fossil evidence, and then you add to it irreducible complexity, it makes Darwin's theory very, very much in jeopardy. And then that's just irreducible complexity within an organism. With ecosystems, there's whole elaborate symbiotic relationships that happen, that if these two animals aren't working together, they wouldn't exist. There's special diets. All that interrelationship is super, super important. And this is just, I'm not trying to get political here, but like when you start killing off species because we're greedy, it actually messes up things. So I find it very confusing that the evolutionist cares more about the environment than the Christian. It boggles my mind that, I'm going on a tangent here, and this has nothing to do with politics. I'm just saying like Christians should be foremost at recycling and taking care of the planet, because my wife is an artist. She draws. Imagine she draws me a picture. And then oh, that's beautiful. And then I'm hungry and I'm just eating over it and I'm slopping my food down on it. And I take it with me in the bathroom and pardon, but I spill on it. And all of a sudden, like what she drew for me is just covered in my waste. How does she feel? The Christian does that to the environment. It's God's artwork. And we just, because we want to consume and we make money our idol and we worship the dollar, we destroy the environment. I'm not arguing about whether or not the government should be involved in it. I'm just saying on an individual level, Christianity should care about God's creation. And I think it's a problem, and it also is a reason why evolutionists look at Christians and be like, they don't care about the environment that they are fighting to make me believe God created. It's a contradiction. This has nothing to do with politics. This has to do with the Bible and the truth, and I have to put it out there. I'm not telling you anything politically. I'm just saying it's God's handiwork. If we believe that, we should treat it like that. And they just don't understand. It can come back to bite us big time if we start messing with the ecosystems. They're very, very complicated. So one of the pictures in the textbook, or the things that talked about, at least when I was there, and it was these peppered moths. And it was something that when I saw that, I'm like, man, that just shows that's true. And then it's actually just microevolution, even if it was true, but it's actually not even true. These peppered moths. The idea was that the lightly colored moth was more prevalent, and then the Industrial Revolution happened, and so smog would happen, and then the darker ones would come in, and they would survive more because the trees are getting darker, the pollution's happening. So in the 1950s, Bernard Kittlewell performed a series of experiments that suggested that predatory birds ate the light-colored moths when they became more visible and pollution darkened tree trunks. It appeared that natural selection played a role in the survival of the dark-colored variety of moths. In fact, most biology textbooks illustrate this example of natural selection with photographs showing two varieties of peppered moths resting on light and dark-colored trees. What the textbooks do not tell you is that these photographs have been staged, meaning they were dead moths pinned onto the tree trunks, and peppered moths actually never ever rest on tree trunks in the wild. The percentage of melanics, or the darker colored moths predicted by the theory, did not actually materialize in the different areas of England. In some of the areas, melanism increased after the introduction of pollution controls. So pollution actually goes down, the black ones increased. The results of Kittlewell's experiment were not as dependent on the presence of lichen as he had thought. Later, it was determined that the tree trunks are not the natural resting place of the peppered moths. Moths normally rest underneath or on the side of narrow branches. The moths were manually placed in the desired positions for the experiment. Basically, they're staged. This cast serious doubt on the validity of the experiment, and the evidence Darwin lacked, Kittlewell lacked as well. That's in the mid-'80s. But in the 90s, it was on my textbook still, the story of industrial melanism must be shelved as a paradigm of new Darwinian evolution. And I don't know, I've not been in the public school, but in the 90s, it was still used as evidence, even though in the 80s, everyone's saying it's false. It's like they teach the kids these things that have been proven false, and then you get to the upper levels, and they finally tell you it's wrong, but you're already programmed to believe in evolution, so you don't care. That's a problem. That's why it's a problem when a kid goes away to college and experiences this for the first time. Half the stuff that even makes it in a college textbook is obsolete in science by the time you get it. So don't throw away your faith because it's constantly changing. And it never catches up. So gradualism is this Darwinian idea that evolution proceeds chiefly by the accumulation of general changes. Most people have rejected that. So like I said, they have Stephen Jay Gould's the one who came up with this, punctuated equilibrium. It's the hypothesis that evolutionary development is marked by isolated episodes of rapid speciation between long periods of little or no change. So instead of like a gradual climb with a bunch of intermediate species, it's more like steps. And so the idea is that mutant happens. And the comic X-Men, and that's where that comes from. These mutants, these totally different things come out, and these steps happen suddenly, like a human would give birth to a superhuman. Okay. That's where the idea of X-Men comes from. And
so they start multiplying to create more superhumans.
Yes. Okay. Or you would say like there's this ape-like ancestor that suddenly created a human. Okay. There's problems with that. And let's just stick with the idea of mutation. So one of the animals that breeds really fast is fruit flies. They're super annoying. You get one in your kitchen and you can't get rid of them. Right? Right? Hodani, they're your favorite? No, she does not like fruit flies. So they're really small, they breed really fast. And so they found that they produce a lot of mutants because of that. And so here's all these mutants that have come. You have curly wings, white eyes, some just die, yellow body, stubby wings, wingless. And so they're doing all this, but it's funny, all of these don't make it. For some reason, they don't survive or they don't produce offspring. So the mutants, if a mutant can't produce offspring, what good is it in evolution? So small-scale evolution within a species, such as we've seen in domestic breeding, microevolution, makes use of various already present in a population. But large-scale evolution, such as Darwin envisioned, is impossible unless new variations arise from time to time. So you have to have punctuated equilibrium. Genes consisting of DNA are carriers of hereditary information. The problem is no new variations originate as mutations, and most mutations are harmful. So unless a mutations affect morphology, the shape of an organism, it cannot provide the raw materials for morphological evolution. Morphological mutations have been extensively studied in the fruit fly. Some mutations have caused two-winged fruit flies to develop basically a second pair of wings. But first, it's still the same wings. It's not a completely new structure. For a mutation to really, it would have to produce a leg. Not even a leg, it would have to produce, some other thing. But this is just another wing. The problem is these extra wings don't have muscles to them. So they don't fly, they don't help it fly. And it's genetically manipulated. They don't naturally occur. You have to manipulate the gene to make the fruit fly. So here's a normal fruit fly. Buzzing around your fruit. So we always put the fruit in the fridge now, because she doesn't like fruit flies. So here's this mutated one. Does it look like it's special? Does it look like Yeah, because it's weighing down by the extra, they can't fly. It's not helping. The mutation actually would be a hindrance. So they provide no evidence that DNA mutations supply the raw materials for morphological evolution. They're not useful. The four-winged fruit fly does not provide the missing evidence for evolution. A fruit fly on top of that is still a fruit fly. It doesn't matter how many wings it has. But if it was occurring in the wild and had the extra pair of wings, it would just get eaten easier, or it wouldn't be able to fly to food and it would die. Major mutations such as Bithrax are such evident freaks that these monsters can be designated only as hopeless. They are so utterly unbalanced that they would have not the slightest change of escaping elimination through natural selection. Speaking of this multi-winged fruit fly. Geneticists have found that the number of wings in flies can be changed through mutations in a single gene, but that doesn't help. So another thing that happens is mutations can have biochemical effects, not just morphological effects. Biochemical meaning the chemical inside their body versus like an extra arm or something like that. So this happens with bacteria that becomes resistant to antibiotics. That way, if you get sick with a virus, don't get antibiotics. It won't help you. It'll just create more bacteria-resistant bacteria inside of you, and it would be a problem. So that's just my health nugget. Make sure you have a bacteria infection before you get antibiotics, because this does happen. So biochemical mutations cannot explain large-scale changes in organisms. So here we have the green ones would be the ones resistant to antibiotics. You apply the antibiotics, and all of the bacteria that don't have that die, and just the ones that are resistant survive. And then they multiply. And if you keep dumping antibiotics, the only ones that would survive are what? Those ones, and then they become superbacteria. So these superbacteria, when they reintroduce it with the regular bacteria without antibiotics, you know what happens? They disperse. It's just like the Darwin's finches. It's a rubber banding. The only way antibacteria-resistant bacteria can thrive is in an environment full of antibiotics. That's why if you overwash your hands and overuse hand sanitizer and overuse antibiotics, you're creating an environment for these things to thrive, and you won't be able to kill them off when you need to. However, if you get a little dirty once in a while and let your kids play in the mud and these kinds of things, when they do get sick with regular bacteria, antibiotics will work. But it's not a new species. It's just the same bacteria. So mutations, in order for punctuated equilibrium to exist, also haven't happened in such a way that a new, completely radical animal has taken place. Like we have not seen a completely new animal popping out of another animal. All we see, these two examples, the fruit flies and the bacteria, are more gradual, more what Darwin said would happen, but then they don't work in the wild. So another thing that people teach is homology. So homology is the idea that, these have similar structures. They all have phalanges, they all have a radius and ulna, and they all have the regular arm bone and shoulder joints. So they all have similar, widely different function, but similar bone structure. And this is called homology, similar structures. So creationists regard organisms as constructed on a common plan. Darwin explained homology on the basis of the theory of descent with slow and slight modifications. The evolutionist explanation attributes homologous features to similar genes inherited by a common ancestor. Darwin's followers later redefined homology to mean similarity due to common ancestry. That's circular reasoning. The development of the digits proceeds from the posterior to the anterior direction in frogs, but from the head to the tail in salamanders. So when it's developing inside its egg, the frog develops in the opposite direction as the salamander. So the end result looks similar, but the way it's formed is vastly different. It's also been discovered that non-homologous structures commonly arise from completely identical genes. So you'll have the same gene, different animal, making different things. And some similar structures are not acquired through common ancestry. The octopus eye and the human eye are very similar in their abilities, but the octopus and the human are very far apart on the evolutionary tree. And so the Pontiac lug nuts will fit on a Chevy. Why? We're from Detroit, we should know this. Who makes Pontiac?
General Motors.
Who makes Chevy?
General Motors.
So the lug nuts fit, why?
Because the same company makes it.
Same engineer, same designer. So similar parts can also be evidence for common designer. So, same data, your pre-cognitive worldview is going to give you a different interpretation. So Darwin actually was perplexed with the human eye, the human ear, the human heart, and the human skin. He was like, this boggles my mind how this could evolve. And you look at the eardrum movement is super tiny, and each little movement tells us a different sound. Not even the width of a hydrogen molecule will help you decipher the different sounds. The eye, we cannot even duplicate it. Our best cameras can't do what the eye can do. You ever have that? You see this gorgeous sunset, and you pull out your camera. I don't care what kind of camera you have, and you can make a beautiful picture. It just doesn't capture the sunset like our eye can do it. So we can see clearly at multiple different distances. It's constantly, actually, the eye is actually constantly vibrating, and then our nerves compensate and give us a stabilized picture. A friend of mine actually has a defect where his vision actually doesn't have that, and so his eyes are always shaking because of a defect. It can compensate for the flipping of objects too, because we're actually seeing things upside down, and it reflips it for us. So, and then the other thing people talk about is these things in us that we don't use anymore. But the more people study, they find out actually the tonsils, which you can take out and live without, actually protect you against infections. Having tonsils is better than not having tonsils. However, if they're getting infected and they're going to kill you, it'd be better, even Jesus said, it's better to go into heaven with one arm than with two. That kind of thing. There are parts of our body. You can live without a kidney, but it'd be better to have both. You get what I'm saying? So the tonsils, you can live without them, but they do have function. The appendix actually helps you also. Both the tonsils and the appendix actually help you with infection. They're both there. Both tonsils and appendix are now believed to help us against Hodgkin's disease. But again, if you have appendicitis, you're going to die. It would be better to get it removed, but it'd be even better to not get it at all. The appendix, here long regarded as a vestigial organ with no function in the human body, the appendix is now thought to be one of the sites where immune responses are initiated. There is no longer any justification for regarding the veriform appendix as a vestigial structure. But this is like 1947. This is 1980, but they were talking about this in 1947, and we still have this idea that the appendix is absolutely worthless. Another one that people say, the tailbone. Just today, I was just researching this, double-checking, and I typed in tailbone, and it said it's a part of the body that we don't need anymore because we don't have a tail anymore. The tailbone is where important muscles are attached, the levator ani and the coccygeus. I don't know how to pronounce those muscle names. Without those muscles, your pelvic organs would collapse, that is, fall down. Without them, you could not have a bowel movement, you could not walk or sit upright, and other important marital functions would not be as pleasurable. If you think you don't need one, you could always have it removed. There's a famous creationist, and he was debating a guy about this, and he said the tailbone is a vestigial organ, and he says, I'll pay to have you remove it. And the guy didn't say anything because he knew AMP, he knew anatomy and physiology, he knew muscles attach. All your muscles attach to bones. All bones are important. You can't just remove them. And it was just like silent. So, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, as the Bible said, very complicated. So, irreducible complexity and lack of fossil evidence are big reasons why I don't have enough belief to throw out my faith, if that makes sense. I understand there's other people. Again, I don't think it's science that creates atheists. I do think that they have logical explanations. It's not completely, I'm not presenting that. You'll get that in the science textbook. But I'm calling the question what they're not bringing out, and I call them to question some of their arguments as not being logical. And so if you're an atheist, don't use vestigial organs, because they're not. Don't use homology, because that data can be looked at both ways. You've got to give the fossil record, and you've got to I've read arguments against irreducible complexity, and they're literally just fictional manifestations of how they think it could happen, but it's just a fable trying to back up your thing. We have our stories in Genesis, you have your stories trying to explain evolution. And so when you look at everything and put it together, I think that a Christian can be logical, I think they can be rational, and they can believe in creation. I can't disprove evolution 100%. I've presented serious gaps in the theory tonight, both nights, then enough that you don't have to leave the faith. In fact, I had a friend who he became basically what we'd call the theistic evolutionist, and I asked him, why? Why do you believe it? Why, what evidence do you have? And he said, well, I just think Genesis is not literal. That I was like, no, I don't care about that. Why would you believe in the theory of evolution? What's your number one reason? He would say something, and I'm like, that's microevolution. I think that fits fine with a literal Genesis novel, Genesis narrative. And he couldn't give me a reason. And so then I was like, it must be something else. And so I have talked to my atheist friends, and I just said, give me a reason. I've had arguments with them, not heated, but just they're trying to prove it to me. And I just said, everything you're proving to me is just microevolution. I'm talking about macroevolution. Where's the evidence? And they get really bothered and upset, almost like when you try telling the Seventh-day Adventist that the Sabbath's not true, or you try telling the Book of Mormon's not true, or or a Baptist that hell doesn't burn forever, or some key doctrine of a religion. They get really bothered when I started saying, can you prove it to me? And when they couldn't prove it to me, they got very emotionally upset, and I'm thinking, I thought you guys are supposed to be the objective ones. So it's okay. We can admit we don't know everything. And I can't disprove evolution, and I can't prove God, but I do believe we can be logical and rational and think things through and still believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God. Let us pray. Oh, Heavenly Father, I don't think Darwin murdered you. I do think it gave a logical way out for people that are struggling with several things that are happening, and misinterpretations of the Bible, bad representation by Christians, and there's reasons, very good reasons. Help us not to be part of those reasons anymore if we're believers. And if we're struggling with doubts, help us to be able to go to you for answers. I pray for this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Isn't it nice to know that God says, come, let us reason together, and that the evidence points to a designer who loves variety and beauty and complexity and compatibility. So I so appreciate what Pastor Nathaniel is presenting to us. Tomorrow night, the topic will be, what about dinosaurs? What was the original Earth like? And was it similar to what we find today, or was it vastly different? He will examine dinosaurs and also talk about how they fit into the Bible, which is going to be very interesting. So come back tomorrow night at 7 o'clock and join us again. Don't forget to pick up your flyer on the way out. Take a picture of the link that will take you to past episodes. And just bow with me for a quick prayer. Father, again, we thank you for these presentations and everything that you've brought to us. We ask, Lord, for safety on our drive home, and bring us back together tomorrow night to learn more. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. Have a great night.